The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Falls, Montana, as Martha Elizabeth Hawkins swept the front porch of her family's general store. At 28, she had grown accustomed to the whispered conversations that followed her wherever she went in their small town of barely 300 souls. The burn scar that covered the left side of her face, a cruel reminder of the kitchen fire that had claimed her mother's life 15 years ago, had become the defining feature by which the townspeople knew her. "Poor Martha," they'd say, shaking their heads with practiced sympathy. "Such a kind soul, but who'd want to marry that face?" Martha had heard variations of this sentiment so often that she'd learned to tune it out, like the persistent buzz of summer flies. She focused instead on the rhythm of her broom against the weathered wooden planks, the familiar comfort of routine, and the way the morning light painted the distant Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and purple. The bell above the store's door chimed as her father, Samuel Hawkins, emerged with his coffee cup in hand. At 62, Samuel bore the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life working with his hands, first as a farmer, then as the owner of Cedar Falls' only general store, after a drought had claimed their family farm. "Another beautiful morning, Martha," he said, settling into his rocking chair with a soft grunt. "Mrs. Peterson will be by for her weekly supplies soon. She mentioned yesterday that her arthritis is acting up again." Martha nodded, leaning her broom against the porch railing. "I'll prepare her usual order and maybe add some of that liniment Dr. Harrison recommended. It seemed to help Mr. Johnson's back pain." Samuel smiled at his daughter's thoughtfulness. Despite everything she'd endured, the accident, the cruel words, the loneliness that seemed to follow her like a shadow, Martha had maintained a gentle heart that sought to ease others' suffering. It was a quality that made her father proud and broke his heart in equal measure. As if summoned by their conversation, Mrs. Peterson's wagon appeared at the far end of Main Street, driven by her teenage grandson, Tommy. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, a larger wagon pulled by two sturdy draft horses made its way toward the store. Martha recognized the driver immediately, James William Torres, though most folks simply called him Will. Will owned the largest ranch in the county, the Double T, which sprawled across nearly 5,000 acres of prime grazing land about 12 miles outside town. At 35, he was what the unmarried women of Cedar Falls and the surrounding counties considered quite the catch: tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that seemed perpetually tousled by the wind and kind brown eyes that missed very little. He was also notably quiet, speaking only when necessary and preferring the company of his cattle and horses to most people. Martha felt her heart skip slightly as Will's wagon drew closer. She'd harbored feelings for the rancher for years, ever since he'd come to their store to buy supplies for his ailing ranch hand, and had spoken to her with the same respectful tone he used for everyone else. No pity, no uncomfortable glances at her scarred face, just simple human decency. "Morning, Samuel," Will said as he stepped down from his wagon, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. His voice carried the slight accent of his Mexican grandmother, though he'd been born and raised in Montana. "Martha," he touched the brim of his hat in her direction, and she felt warmth spread through her chest at the acknowledgement. "Will," Samuel replied, rising from his chair. "What brings you to town so early?" "Need to stock up on supplies for the winter. Got word there might be an early snow this year, and I want to be prepared." Will's eyes swept over the store's exterior, taking in the freshly swept porch and the carefully arranged display of autumn goods in the window. "Looks like you've been busy," Martha found her voice. "Father says it's going to be a harsh winter. We've been preparing extra stock for everyone." Will nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. Mind if I take a look at what you've got?" As the three of them moved into the store, Martha couldn't help but notice how Will's presence seemed to fill the space. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, his hands gentle as he examined the quality of the rope and tools, his voice soft as he discussed quantities and prices with her father. The store itself was a testament to the Hawkins family's dedication to their community. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with everything from basic food staples to farming equipment, medicines and household goods. The air carried the mingled scents of leather, coffee, and the lavender soap Martha made herself, a skill she'd learned from her mother before the accident. "Martha makes that soap herself," Samuel mentioned, noticing Will's interest in the neatly wrapped bars. "Got quite a talent for it. Uses herbs from her garden behind the store." Will picked up one of the bars, inhaling its subtle fragrance. "My grandmother used to make soap like this, said store-bought never cleaned as well or smelled as sweet." He looked at Martha with genuine interest. What herbs do you use? Martha felt her cheeks warm under his attention. Lavender, rosemary, sometimes mint. I grow them all myself. The lavender seems to help people sleep better, and the rosemary is good for aches and pains. I'd like to buy a dozen bars if you have them, Will said. My ranch hands are always complaining about store-bought soap being too harsh on their skin. As Martha gathered the requested items, she became aware of voices approaching from outside. Through the store's front window, she could see several of the town's women gathering near the Peterson wagon, their heads bent together in animated conversation. Even from a distance, she could tell they were discussing something or someone with great interest. "Oh my, is that Will Torres's wagon?" came the voice of Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife and unofficial town gossip. "What's he doing here so early?" "Probably buying supplies," replied Mrs. Crawford, the sheriff's wife. "Though I heard from my cousin in Billings that he's been asking around about eligible women. Time for him to settle down, I suppose." Martha's hands stilled on the bars of soap she was wrapping. She'd heard rumors about Will's supposed search for a wife, but hearing it spoken aloud made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Well, he won't find anyone suitable around here," Mrs. Abernathy continued, her voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "Most of the young ladies have already married, and the few left," she trailed off significantly. "You mean Martha Hawkins?" Mrs. Crawford supplied. Such a shame about her face. She'd make someone a fine wife otherwise, good with numbers, can cook and clean, takes care of her father so well, but men want a woman they can be proud to show off, don't they? Martha's face burned with humiliation. She glanced quickly at Will, who had gone very still near the counter, where her father was tallying his order. Had he heard? The rigid set of his shoulders suggested he had. "Now, Martha," Samuel said gently, his voice carrying a warning tone that suggested he too had heard the women's conversation. "Don't mind them. They've got nothing better to do than wag their tongues." But Martha couldn't shake the words. They echoed in her mind like a bell tolling, "Men want a woman they can be proud to show off." She'd always known it was true, but hearing it spoken so casually, so matter-of-factly, felt like a fresh wound. Will cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "About that soap," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "My grandmother always said the best soap came from women who put their heart into making it, said you could tell the difference." He met Martha's eyes directly. "These smell like they've got plenty of heart in them." The simple kindness of his words made Martha's throat tight with emotion. She managed a small smile and continued wrapping the soap bars in brown paper, securing each one with a thin ribbon. Outside, the women's conversation had moved on to other topics, but Martha remained acutely aware of their presence. She knew that by evening, word would spread through Cedar Falls that Will Torres had spent the morning at the Hawkins store, and speculation about his intentions would run rampant. As Will prepared to leave, his arms full of supplies, he paused at the door. "Martha," he said quietly, "I was wondering if you might consider making some of that liniment you mentioned for Mrs. Peterson. My horses have been working hard preparing for winter, and I think it might help their sore muscles." Martha blinked in surprise. Yes, of course. I could have some ready by next week. I'd appreciate that." Will's eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary. "And Martha, don't let other people's words define your worth. Some folks talk because they don't know how to listen." With that, he touched his hat brim again and stepped out into the morning sunshine, leaving Martha staring after him with her heart hammering against her ribs. As his wagon disappeared down Main Street, Samuel placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder. "That's a good man, Martha. One of the few who sees what really matters." Martha nodded, unable to trust her voice. Through the window, she watched the cluster of women disperse, each heading their separate ways to spread whatever gossip they'd collected. But for the first time in years, their words didn't cut quite as deep. Will Torres had looked at her, really looked at her, and seen something worth defending. It was a gift she would treasure long after the dust from his wagon had settled on the empty street. 3 weeks had passed since Will Torres's morning visit to the Hawkins store, and Martha had found herself thinking about their conversation more often than she cared to admit. She'd prepared the horse liniment he'd requested, carefully mixing the herbs and oils her mother had taught her to use, but Will hadn't returned to collect it. Instead, he'd sent his ranch foreman, Diego Morales, a weathered man in his 50s who'd worked for the Torres family since Will was a boy. "Senor Will, he says to tell you the soap works very well," Diego had said with a warm smile, his English colored by his native Spanish. "The men, they are asking where they can get more, and he wants to know if you have the medicine ready for the horses." Martha had handed over the liniment, with careful instructions for its use, but she couldn't shake the disappointment that Will hadn't come himself. Perhaps she'd read too much into his kindness that morning. Perhaps he was simply a decent man who treated everyone with respect, nothing more. Now as Martha stood in front of the cracked mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the collar of her best dress, a modest navy blue garment she'd sewn herself, she wondered if she was making a mistake. The annual Cedar Falls Harvest Social was tonight, and for the first time in 5 years she'd decided to attend. The social was held every October in the town's small community hall, a wooden building that served as everything, from a meeting place to a dance hall depending on the occasion. It was the highlight of the town's social calendar, where eligible young people could meet, families could catch up on news, and the entire community could celebrate another successful harvest season. Martha had stopped attending after the incident at the 1889 social, when young Thomas Brennan had publicly declared that dancing with her would be like dancing with a scarecrow, might scare the other fellows away. The laughter that had followed still echoed in her memory, but something about Will's words that morning weeks ago had given her a spark of courage she hadn't felt in years. "For you look beautiful, dear," Samuel said from the doorway, his voice gentle with pride and concern. He wore his best suit, a dark wool ensemble that had seen better days, but was still respectable. "Are you certain you want to go?" Martha turned from the mirror, her fingers unconsciously moving to touch the scarred side of her face, a habit she'd developed over the years. "I'm tired of hiding, Father. Will Torres was right. I can't let other people's words define my worth." Samuel nodded, though worry creased his weathered features. He'd watched his daughter retreat from the world after her mother's death and the cruel treatment that followed. Seeing her emerge from that shell filled him with hope and terror in equal measure. The walk to the community hall took only 10 minutes, but with each step, Martha felt her resolve wavering. She could hear the music drifting from the open windows, a lively fiddle tune accompanied by piano and guitar. Lanterns hung from the porch eaves, casting warm golden light across the entrance where people gathered in small groups, talking and laughing. Martha recognized most of the faces. Cedar Falls was too small for anonymity. There was Sheriff Crawford with his wife and their twin daughters, both 18 and considered the most eligible young women in town. Mrs. Abernathy held court near the refreshment table, her voice carrying over the music as she regaled a group of women with the latest gossip. The younger men clustered near the far wall, occasionally glancing toward the dance floor, where several couples swayed to the music. "Martha!" The voice belonged to Dr. Harrison, the town's physician, and one of the few people who had always treated her with genuine kindness. He approached with his wife Eleanor, both of them smiling warmly. "How wonderful to see you here. It's been far too long." "Dr. Harrison, Mrs. Harrison," Martha replied, grateful for their friendly reception. "Thank you, I thought it was time I stopped being such a hermit." "Nonsense," Eleanor Harrison said, linking her arm through Martha's. "You've been taking care of your father and running that store practically single-handed. If anyone deserves a night of fun, it's you." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "And between you and me, half the women in this town could learn a thing or two about kindness from you." As they talked, Martha became aware of whispered conversations around them. She caught fragments. "Can you believe she came? That poor girl, showing her face here. Someone should tell her." But she forced herself to stand straighter, remembering Will's words about not letting others define her worth. The music ended, and the fiddle player announced a break. It was then that Martha noticed a familiar figure entering the hall. Will Torres stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the night sky. He'd clearly made an effort for the occasion. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean white shirt with a black vest and matching trousers. But it was his eyes that captured Martha's attention. They swept the room until they found her, and for a moment the rest of the world seemed to fade away. "Well, well, Mrs." Abernathy's voice cut through the sudden quiet that had fallen over the hall. "Will Torres, as I live and breathe. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how to socialize." Will's jaw tightened slightly, but he managed a polite nod. "Mrs. Abernathy. Good evening, everyone." Several of the younger women immediately began adjusting their hair and straightening their dresses. Will Torres's arrival was clearly the highlight of their evening, and Martha felt her chest tighten with a familiar ache. She began to turn away, intending to find a quiet corner where she could wait for a respectable amount of time before leaving, when she heard his voice. "Martha." She turned back to find Will standing directly in front of her, his hat in his hands. The conversations around them had died to curious whispers. "Mr. Torres," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was hoping I might find you here," he said, his eyes never leaving her face. "I wanted to thank you for the liniment. It worked better than anything I've ever used. My horses are moving like colts again." Martha felt her cheeks warm. I'm so glad it helped. Diego said the soap was working well too. Better than well. I've had 3 neighboring ranchers ask where they can get some. Will's smile was genuine, transforming his usually serious features. I was wondering if you might consider making it a regular business arrangement. I could provide a steady order if you're interested. Before Martha could respond, the music started again, a slower, more romantic melody. Around them, couples began moving toward the dance floor. Will's eyes dropped to the floor for a moment, and Martha could see him gathering courage for something. "Martha," he said quietly, "would you do me the honor of dancing with me?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Martha was acutely aware of every eye in the hall focused on them, every ear straining to hear her response. She could practically feel the shock radiating from the other women, the disbelief that someone like Will Torres would ask someone like her to dance. I don't think that's a good idea," Martha whispered, her courage failing her. "People will talk." "People always talk," Will replied, his voice gentle but firm. "The question is whether we're going to let them stop us from doing what we want to do." Mrs. Crawford chose that moment to approach, her smile bright and predatory. "Will, how lovely to see you. You must meet my daughters, Mary and Margaret. They're both accomplished dancers and would be delighted to—" "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford," Will interrupted politely but firmly. "But I've already asked Martha for this dance." He extended his hand toward Martha, his brown eyes steady and encouraging. "What do you say?" Martha looked at his outstretched hand, then at the faces surrounding them. She saw Mrs. Abernathy's shocked expression, the Crawford twins' barely concealed outrage, and her father's encouraging nod from across the room. But mostly, she saw Will's patient, kind eyes waiting for her answer. Taking a deep breath, Martha placed her hand in his. The moment their fingers touched, she felt a jolt of electricity run through her. Will's hand was warm and calloused from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle as he led her onto the dance floor. The crowd parted before them, creating a path that felt both triumphant and terrifying. As they reached the center of the floor, Will placed his other hand carefully on her waist, maintaining a respectful distance. The music swelled around them, and they began to move together with surprising ease. Martha had learned to dance from her mother years ago, but she'd never expected to use those skills again. "You're a natural," Will murmured as they swayed to the melody. "Your mother teach you?" "Yes," Martha replied, her voice tight with emotion. "Before the accident. She said every lady should know how to dance." She was right. Will's eyes never left her face as they moved. "She would be proud to see you now." Around them, other couples had joined the dance, but Martha was only dimly aware of them. She was lost in the feeling of Will's hand in hers, the warmth of his presence, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the room. "Why?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why what?" Will asked, though his eyes suggested he knew exactly what she meant. "Why me? Why ask me to dance when you could have your pick of any woman here?" Will was quiet for a long moment, his hand tightening slightly on her waist as he guided her through a gentle turn. When he spoke, his voice was so soft she had to lean closer to hear him. "Because you're the only one I wanted to dance with," he said simply. "Because when I talk to you, you listen with your heart, not just your ears. Because you see people's pain and try to heal it. Because you're beautiful in ways that matter." Martha's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like this before, with such sincerity, such genuine admiration. She felt tears prick her eyes, but blinked them back, not wanting to make a scene. The song ended too soon, but Will didn't immediately release her hand. Instead, he brought it to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so courtly and unexpected that it sent a murmur of surprise through the watching crowd. "Thank you for the dance, Martha," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet hall. "It was the highlight of my evening." As Will escorted her back to where her father waited, Martha was acutely aware of the stunned silence that had fallen over the social. She could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered comment that would follow this moment for weeks to come. But for the first time in her life, she didn't care. The morning after the harvest social dawned grey and bitter, with storm clouds gathering over the distant mountains like an ominous warning. Martha stood behind the counter of the general store, mechanically sorting through the morning's mail delivery, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the previous evening, every word Will had spoken, every gentle touch of his hand. The bell above the door chimed, and Martha looked up to see Mrs. Abernathy enter, followed closely by Mrs. Crawford and 2 other women from the social. Their faces wore expressions of barely contained outrage, mixed with something that looked suspiciously like pity. "Good morning, Martha dear," Mrs. Abernathy began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We thought we should have a little chat with you about last night." Martha's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "Good morning, ladies. What can I help you with today?" "It's what we can help you with," Mrs. Crawford interjected, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "We're concerned about you, dear. About the position you're putting yourself in." "I'm not sure I understand," Martha replied, though she had a sinking feeling she understood perfectly. Mrs. Abernathy exchanged a meaningful look with the other women before continuing. "Will Torres is a fine man, Martha, but he's also one of the wealthiest landowners in the county. Men like that, well, they don't marry women like you." The words hit Martha like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain standing, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Women like me? Oh, darling," Mrs. Peterson, who had joined the group, spoke up, her voice gentle but no less cutting. "You're a sweet girl and you've been through so much, but you mustn't let yourself be taken advantage of. A man like Will Torres, he'll have his fun, but when it comes time to choose a wife, he'll want someone who can stand beside him at social functions without embarrassing him." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Mrs. Crawford continued, "We've all seen this before, dear. A wealthy man takes pity on a poor, unfortunate girl, shows her a little attention, and she gets ideas above her station. It never ends well." "That's not," Martha began, but Mrs. Abernathy cut her off. "We're not saying this to be cruel, Martha. We're saying it because we care about you. Will Torres will marry someone from one of the prominent families, someone who can help him expand his social connections, someone who can give him beautiful children he won't be ashamed to claim." The cruelty of the words, delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty, made Martha's vision blur with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to protest that Will had treated her with nothing but respect and kindness, but the words wouldn't come. Samuel Hawkins chose that moment to emerge from the back room, his arms full of inventory. He took one look at the scene, the cluster of women, his daughter's pale face, the tension crackling in the air, and his jaw tightened. "Ladies," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "is there something specific you need to purchase today? Otherwise, I believe Martha has work to do." Mrs. Abernathy bristled at the dismissal. "Samuel, we were just trying to help Martha understand." "I heard what you were trying to do," Samuel interrupted, his voice growing harder, "and I think it's time you left." The women exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for Samuel's firm stance. They were accustomed to being the moral arbiters of Cedar Falls, the ones who decided what was proper and what was not. But something in Samuel's eyes warned them not to push further. "Well," Mrs. Crawford huffed, gathering her dignity around her like a cloak, "we were only trying to help. Come, ladies. Clearly our concern isn't welcome here." As the group filed out of the store, Martha heard Mrs. Abernathy's voice drift back. "Mark my words, this will all end in tears. Poor girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into." The moment the door closed behind them, Martha's composure crumbled. She sank onto the stool behind the counter, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Samuel was at her side instantly, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "Don't listen to them, Martha," he said fiercely. "They're small-minded gossips who can't stand to see someone else happy." "But what if they're right?" Martha whispered through her tears. "What if I'm just fooling myself? What if Will was just being kind and I read too much into it?" "Did you see the way he looked at you last night?" Samuel asked, tilting her chin up to meet his eyes. "Did you see how he ignored every other woman in that room? That wasn't pity, Martha. That was a man who sees something special in you." Before Martha could respond, the bell chimed again and both father and daughter looked up to see Will Torres entering the store. His dark hair was damp from the light rain that had started to fall, and his expression was troubled. He'd obviously witnessed the departure of the women, and the thunder in his brown eyes suggested he'd heard at least part of their conversation. "Good morning," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," Samuel replied, though his protective stance near Martha suggested otherwise. "What can we do for you, Will?" Will's eyes moved to Martha, taking in her red-rimmed eyes and the defensive way she held herself. "I was hoping to speak with Martha, if she's willing, about the soap orders I mentioned." Martha wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "Of course, Father, could you give us a moment?" Samuel hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave his daughter alone in her current state, but Martha's slight nod convinced him to retreat to the back room. The moment they were alone, Will moved closer to the counter, his expression softening. "Martha," he said gently, "what did those women say to you?" Martha looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. "They were just concerned. About me. About last night." "What kind of concerned?" Will's voice had grown dangerously quiet. "They think I'm getting ideas above my station," Martha whispered. "They think you're just taking pity on me, that when it comes time to choose a wife, you'll want someone who won't embarrass you." Will was silent for so long that Martha finally looked up at him. What she saw in his face made her breath catch. His jaw was clenched, his eyes blazing with fury, but when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "And what do you think?" he asked. Martha's throat tightened. I think maybe they're right. I think I let myself hope for something that could never be." Will stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked to the door. For a terrifying instant, Martha thought he was leaving, that the women's words had driven him away, that their cruel predictions were coming true. But instead of opening the door, he reached up and turned the sign from open to closed, then drew the curtains over the front windows. "What are you doing?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Will turned back to her, his expression intense. "I'm making sure we won't be interrupted." He walked back to the counter, his movements deliberate and purposeful. Without warning, he reached across the wooden surface and took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "Martha Elizabeth Hawkins," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I don't give a damn what those women think. I don't care what anyone in this town thinks. I asked you to dance last night because I wanted to dance with you. I'm here now because I want to be here, and if you'll let me, I'd like to court you properly." Martha's eyes widened in shock. "Court me?" "Yes, call on you, bring you flowers, take you for rides in my buggy, show this whole town that I'm serious about you." Will's thumbs brushed across her knuckles, and Martha felt warmth spread through her entire body. "I'm not a man who plays games, Martha. I'm 35 years old and I know what I want. What I want is you. But I'm not beautiful," Martha protested, her free hand moving unconsciously to her scarred cheek. "I'm not the kind of woman men like you marry." Will released one of her hands and reached up to gently cup her face, his thumb tracing the edge of her scar with infinite tenderness. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known," he said simply. "This scar doesn't define you, Martha. Your kindness does. Your strength does. The way you take care of everyone around you, the way you see good in people even when they don't deserve it, that's what makes you beautiful." Tears spilled down Martha's cheeks, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of shame or pain. They were tears of hope, of wonder, of a love she'd never dared to dream possible. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why me? You could have anyone." Will smiled then, the expression transforming his usually serious features. "Because when I'm with you, I feel like the man I want to be. Because you make me laugh. Because you listen when I talk about my dreams for the ranch and you offer ideas that make them better. Because when I imagine my future, you're the only woman I can see in it." The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling around the building. But inside the store, wrapped in the warmth of Will's words and the gentle strength of his hands, Martha felt safer than she had in years. "Those women," she said hesitantly, "they'll never accept this. They'll make our lives miserable. Let them try," Will replied, his voice firm with conviction. "I've built my ranch from nothing, Martha. I've faced down rustlers, survived blizzards, and dealt with drought and disease. I think I can handle a few gossipy women." Martha looked into his eyes and saw the truth there. Not just desire, but genuine love, respect, and unwavering determination. For the first time in her life, someone saw her not as damaged goods or an object of pity, but as a woman worthy of love. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible above the storm. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Will's smile was radiant as he leaned across the counter and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Then it's settled. Tomorrow evening I'll come calling properly. And Martha, don't let anyone tell you you're not worthy of love. You're worthy of everything good this world has to offer." True to his word, Will Torres appeared at the Hawkins store the following evening at precisely 7 o'clock, dressed in his finest Sunday clothes and carrying a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers he'd gathered from the meadows surrounding his ranch. Martha watched from the upstairs window as he approached, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of excitement and terror. She'd spent the entire day second-guessing herself, alternating between euphoric joy and paralyzing doubt. Every time the store's bell chimed, she expected to see Will walk through the door to tell her he'd changed his mind, that he'd come to his senses and realized what a mistake he was making. But now, seeing him stride purposefully up the front steps, she felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly took her breath away. "Martha," Samuel called from downstairs, "your gentleman caller is here." Martha took one last look at herself in the mirror. She'd chosen her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes, and had spent 20 minutes arranging her hair to partially conceal the worst of her scars. She'd even applied a small amount of the rose-tinted lip balm she'd made, but never dared to use. The woman looking back at her from the mirror was still scarred, still imperfect, but there was something new in her expression, a spark of confidence that hadn't been there before. She descended the stairs to find Will, standing in the store's main room, talking quietly with her father. Both men looked up as she appeared, and the expression on Will's face made her feel beautiful for the first time in her life. "Good evening, Martha," Will said, his voice warm with genuine pleasure. "You look lovely." He stepped forward and offered her the bouquet, his fingers brushing hers as she accepted it. The flowers were simple, wild asters, goldenrod, and a few late roses, but they might have been rare orchids for the way they made her feel. "Thank you," she whispered, bringing the flowers to her nose to inhale their sweet fragrance. "They're beautiful." "I thought we might take a walk," Will said, glancing at Samuel for permission. "The evening is pleasant, and I'd like to show you something." Samuel nodded his approval, though his expression carried the protective concern of a father watching his daughter step into unknown territory. "Don't keep her out too late, Will. And remember, she's precious cargo." "I understand completely," Will replied, his tone serious and respectful. "I'll take good care of her." Martha felt warmth bloom in her chest at the easy way the two men spoke about her, as if she were indeed precious, worthy of protection and consideration. She placed the flowers in a vase of water, then allowed Will to help her with her shawl before they stepped out into the crisp October evening. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Main Street was quiet except for the distant sound of piano music, drifting from the saloon and the occasional bark of a dog. As they walked, Martha was acutely aware of the curtains twitching in windows, the faces peering out to watch the unlikely couple stroll down the street. "Let them look," Will said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "They might learn something about what real courtship looks like." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, heading toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. Martha had walked this path countless times, but tonight it felt different, charged with possibility and promise. "Where are we going?" she asked, as they passed the last house on the street. "You'll see," Will replied, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "It's not far." He led her along a winding path that followed the creek, past the old mill that had been abandoned for years, until they reached a small rise overlooking the valley. There, spread out below them, was a view that took Martha's breath away. The Double T Ranch stretched across the horizon, its pastures dotted with cattle, its buildings looking small and neat in the distance. But it was the house that caught her attention, a large two-story structure surrounded by trees, with smoke curling from its chimney and warm light glowing in its windows. "It's beautiful," Martha breathed, settling onto the fallen log Will had clearly placed there for this purpose. "It's home," Will said, sitting beside her. "My grandfather built the original cabin when he first came to Montana. My father expanded it, and I've been adding to it ever since I took over the ranch." He paused, his voice growing softer. "It's too big for one person." Martha felt her cheeks warm at the implication. "How long have you been alone out there?" 5 years, Will replied. "My parents died in a typhoid outbreak when I was 30. I had a younger sister, but she married a man from California and moved there with him. I get letters from her occasionally, but," he shrugged, "the ranch keeps me busy, but it's not the same as having family." "I'm sorry," Martha said, placing her hand gently on his arm. "I know what it's like to lose people you love." Will covered her hand with his own, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her skin. "Your mother's death. It must have been terrible." Martha nodded, swallowing hard against the emotion that always rose when she spoke of that night. She was making dinner when her dress caught fire. "I tried to help her, but..." She touched her scarred cheek unconsciously. "I wasn't quick enough, strong enough. Father says I saved her life by getting her out of the house, but she died 2 days later from her burns." "You were just a child," Will said firmly. "You did everything you could." "I was 13, Martha whispered, "old enough to help, but not old enough to save her." Will turned to face her fully, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. "Martha, listen to me. You were a child trying to save her mother. The fact that you were willing to risk your own life to help her shows the kind of person you are. This scar isn't a mark of failure. It's a badge of courage." Martha felt tears sting her eyes. but they were tears of healing rather than pain. No one had ever framed her story in terms of courage before. In her own mind, she'd always been the girl who wasn't fast enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't enough. "I've never thought of it that way," she admitted. "Well, you should," Will said simply, "because that's what I see when I look at you. Not someone damaged, but someone who's survived. Someone who's taken tragedy and turned it into compassion for others." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. Martha felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with place and everything to do with the man sitting beside her. "Will," she said eventually, "those women yesterday, they said things about your family, about how you'll need to marry someone who can help you socially." Will's jaw tightened slightly. "What exactly did they say?" "That men like you marry women who can stand beside you without embarrassing you. Women who can give you beautiful children you won't be ashamed to claim." Will was quiet for so long that Martha began to worry she'd said too much. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "My grandfather was a poor Mexican vaquero who worked for the previous owner of this land. When the man died without heirs, he left the ranch to my grandfather because he was the only one who'd shown it proper care. My grandmother was a half-breed Cheyenne woman who could barely read English when they married." He turned to look at Martha, his eyes blazing with fierce pride. "They built this ranch together, survived blizzards and droughts and prejudice that would have broken lesser people. They raised my father to be a man of character, not social standing." Martha stared at him, stunned by this revelation. She'd known Will's heritage was mixed, but she'd never realized the full extent of what his family had overcome. "My father married my mother because he loved her," Will continued, "not because she could help him climb some social ladder. She was the daughter of a blacksmith, and she was the strongest woman I ever knew. She taught me that worth isn't measured by what society thinks of you, but by what you think of yourself and how you treat others." He stood and walked to the edge of the rise, his silhouette dark against the star-filled sky. "I've spent my whole life watching people judge others by their appearance, their heritage, their station in life. I've seen good people dismissed because they didn't fit some narrow definition of acceptability. I swore I'd never be that kind of man." Martha joined him at the edge, her heart full of admiration for his principles and his courage. "Your parents would be proud of you." "I hope so," Will said quietly, "because I intend to follow their example. I'm going to court you properly, Martha. I'm going to show this town that real love isn't about appearances or social standing. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be better than you are." He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. "I know this won't be easy. People will talk. They'll try to make things difficult for us, but I'm willing to face that if you are." Martha looked into his eyes and saw not just love, but respect, determination, and unwavering loyalty. This man was offering her not just his heart, but his protection, his partnership, his future. For the first time in her life, someone was choosing her, not settling for her, not pitying her, but actively choosing her above all others. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I'm willing." Will's smile was radiant as he brought her hands to his lips, pressing gentle kisses to her knuckles. "Then let's show them what real love looks like." As they walked back toward town, Martha felt as if she were floating. The same streets that had witnessed her shame and humiliation now bore witness to her joy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new whispers, new attempts to undermine their happiness. But tonight, walking beside the man who saw her true worth, she felt invincible. The courtship had begun, and Martha Elizabeth Hawkins was ready to fight for her chance at love. The weeks that followed Will's declaration brought a routine that Martha had never dared to imagine. Every Tuesday and Friday evening, he would arrive at the store at 7 o'clock sharp, dressed in his finest clothes and carrying some small token, wildflowers, a book he thought she might enjoy, or occasionally a piece of jewelry he'd ordered from the catalog in Billings. They would walk together through the streets of Cedar Falls, talking about everything and nothing, sharing dreams and memories with the easy intimacy of two people falling deeply in love. The town's reaction was predictably mixed. Some residents, particularly the older men who respected Will's business acumen and steady character, began to view the courtship with grudging acceptance. Others, led by the circle of women who had confronted Martha that morning weeks ago, grew increasingly hostile as it became clear that Will's intentions were serious. It was a cold November evening when everything changed. Martha was closing the store, counting the day's receipts while her father prepared their simple supper upstairs, when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Through the window, She could see 6 riders dismounting in front of the store, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats. The bell chimed as the men entered, and Martha's blood turned to ice as she recognized their leader, Thomas Brennan, the same man who had humiliated her at the social 5 years earlier. Now in his early 30s, he had grown into a large, heavy-set man with small, cruel eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently twisted in a sneer. He owned a moderate spread about 20 miles outside town and was known for his quick temper and his tendency to solve problems with his fists. "Well, well," Brennan said, his voice carrying the slur of a man who had been drinking. "If it ain't the scarred princess herself." Martha's hand stilled on the money she was counting. "The store is closed, Mr. Brennan. If you need supplies, you'll have to come back tomorrow." "Oh, we ain't here for supplies," Brennan replied, stepping closer to the counter. His companions, rough-looking men Martha didn't recognize, spread out behind him, effectively blocking the exits. "We're here to talk some sense into you." "I don't know what you mean," Martha said, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. "Sure you do," Brennan continued, his tone growing more menacing. "You know exactly what we mean. This little game you're playing with Will Torres has gone on long enough." Martha lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "My relationship with Mr. Torres is none of your business." Brennan's laugh was harsh and ugly. "See, that's where you're wrong, Scarface. Will Torres is one of the most important men in this county. He's got business dealings with half the ranchers around here, including me. And when he makes a fool of himself over some damaged goods, it reflects poorly on all of us. Get out," Martha said, her voice rising. "Get out of my store right now." "Or what?" Brennan stepped closer, and Martha could smell the whiskey on his breath. "You'll call for help? Your old man upstairs, he's even more pathetic than you are." That was too much. Martha reached for the shotgun her father kept behind the counter, but Brennan was faster. He lunged forward and grabbed her wrist, twisting it until she cried out in pain. "Now that's not very friendly," he said, his grip tightening. "All we want is for you to do the right thing. End this charade with Torres. Tell him you've realized what a mistake you're making. Save everyone the embarrassment." "Let go of me," Martha gasped, trying to pull free. "Not until you listen to reason," Brennan snarled. "Torres needs a real wife, not some scarred-up charity case. He needs someone who can give him strong sons, someone he can be proud to show off, not someone who makes people turn away in disgust." The words hit Martha like physical blows, each one designed to tear down the confidence Will had helped her build. She felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not in front of these men. Not ever again." "You're wrong," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Will loves me. He chose me. Out of pity," Brennan spat. "He feels sorry for you, that's all. But pity ain't love, and it sure ain't enough to build a marriage on. How long do you think it'll last once he realizes what he's tied himself to?" Before Martha could respond, the store's back door burst open and Samuel Hawkins appeared, his old cavalry revolver in his hands. At 62, he might have been past his prime, but his eyes were steady and his voice was ice cold. "Take your hands off my daughter, Brennan, or I'll put a hole in you big enough to drive a wagon through." Brennan released Martha's wrist, but didn't back down. "This ain't your fight, old man. This is about what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone is for you to get out of my store before I lose my temper," Samuel replied, the gun never wavering. "And if I hear you've been spreading lies about my daughter, I'll come looking for you." For a moment, the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Brennan smiled, a cold, calculating expression that made Martha's skin crawl. "You can't protect her forever, Hawkins, and you can't force Torres to marry her. Sooner or later, he's going to come to his senses. When he does, she'll be left with nothing but broken dreams and a broken heart." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Think about what I said, Scarface. Save yourself the humiliation. End it now, while you still have some dignity left." The men filed out of the store, their laughter echoing in the night air. Martha stood frozen behind the counter, Brennan's words echoing in her mind like a curse. Samuel lowered his revolver and moved quickly to her side. "Martha, are you hurt? Did he—" "I'm fine," Martha whispered, but she wasn't. She was far from fine. The seed of doubt that Brennan had planted was already growing, spreading through her thoughts like poison. What if he was right? What if Will's feelings for her were based on pity rather than love? What if she was just fooling herself, clinging to a dream that could never be reality? The next morning brought no relief. Martha woke to find the store's front window smeared with mud and horse manure, and the word "ugly" scrawled across the glass in white paint. She cleaned it off before her father could see it, but the damage was done. The message was clear. She was not welcome in Will's world, and there were those who would go to great lengths to make sure she knew it. Throughout the day, she found herself jumping at every sound, flinching whenever the door chimed. The confidence Will had helped her build seemed to crumble a little more with each passing hour. By evening, when he arrived for their regular walk, she could barely meet his eyes. "Martha," Will said immediately, taking her hands in his. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Martha pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. "Maybe we should stop seeing each other." Will's face went very still. "What?" "This courtship," Martha said, the words feeling like glass in her throat. "Maybe it's not such a good idea after all." "Where is this coming from?" Will demanded, his voice sharp with concern and confusion. "Yesterday you were happy. We talked about visiting my ranch next week. What's changed?" Martha couldn't tell him about Brennan's visit, couldn't bear to repeat those cruel words. Instead, she fell back on the fears that had plagued her since childhood. "I've been thinking about what people are saying," she said quietly. "About us, about what kind of wife I'd make." "I don't care what people are saying," Will said fiercely. "I care about what you're thinking, what you're feeling." "I'm thinking that maybe they're right," Martha whispered. "Maybe I am just fooling myself. Maybe you do deserve someone better." Will stared at her for a long moment, then reached out and tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Martha Elizabeth Hawkins, I've told you once and I'll tell you again. You are not less than anyone. You are not a consolation prize or a charity case. You are the woman I love, the woman I want to marry, the woman I want to build a life with. But what if—" "No," Will interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "No more what ifs. No more listening to people who don't know your heart or mine. I'm going to ask you one question and I want you to answer honestly. Do you love me?" Martha felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I love you." "Then that's all that matters," Will said, pulling her into his arms. "Everything else is just noise." He held her as she cried, his hand stroking her hair, his voice murmuring words of comfort and reassurance. And slowly, gradually, Martha felt her fears begin to recede. Brennan's words still echoed in her mind, but Will's presence, his unwavering love and support, was stronger. "I'm scared," she admitted against his chest. "I know," Will replied, his voice soft with understanding. "But we're going to face this together. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As they stood there in the growing darkness, Martha made a decision. She would not let fear win. She would not let cruel words and small minds destroy the best thing that had ever happened to her. She would fight for this love, for this man who saw her true worth. The test of faith had begun, and Martha was determined to pass it. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Cedar Falls in a thick layer of snow by the first week of December. The harsh weather seemed to mirror the tension that had settled over the town like a heavy shroud. Word of Brennan's confrontation with Martha had spread through the community's informal network of gossips and troublemakers, creating two distinct camps. Those who believed Will Torres was making a terrible mistake, and those who admired his loyalty to the woman he loved. Martha had grown stronger in the weeks following that terrifying night. Will's unwavering support had given her the courage to hold her head high despite the whispers and stares. She'd even started accompanying him to church on Sundays, sitting beside him in the third pew while half the congregation craned their necks to get a better look at the unlikely couple. It was on a particularly bitter Sunday morning in mid-December that Reverend Matthews made an announcement that would change everything. "As many of you know," the elderly minister said from his pulpit, his voice carrying clearly through the small wooden church, "Christmas is nearly upon us. This year I thought it would be fitting to remind ourselves of the true meaning of love and acceptance by reading from Corinthians during our service." He opened his Bible and began to read. "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others, it is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs." As the familiar words washed over the congregation, Martha felt Will's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of quiet solidarity. She was so focused on the comfort of his touch that she almost missed the Reverend's next words. "Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres." Reverend Matthews paused, his eyes sweeping over the assembled townspeople. These words remind us that true love looks beyond the surface, beyond what the world considers important, and sees the heart beneath. The minister's gaze lingered on Will and Martha for a moment, and Martha felt a flush of warmth at the gentle approval she saw there. Reverend Matthews had been one of the few people in town who had treated her with consistent kindness over the years, and his subtle endorsement of their relationship meant more than she could express. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the snowy churchyard, Martha overheard Mrs. Abernathy speaking in hushed tones to a group of women near the church steps. "Mark my words," the banker's wife was saying, "this whole situation is going to end badly. Torres will come to his senses eventually, and when he does, that poor girl will be left with nothing but a broken heart and a ruined reputation." "Perhaps," came a new voice, and Martha turned to see Mrs. Elena Vasquez, the wife of Diego Morales, Will's ranch foreman. Elena was a small, dignified woman in her 50s who rarely spoke in public but commanded respect throughout the Mexican community that lived on the outskirts of town. "But perhaps Senor Torres knows something about love that the rest of us have forgotten." Mrs. Abernathy bristled at the implied criticism. I think, Elena interrupted gently, that a man who judges a woman by her character rather than her appearance is a man worth respecting. And I think a woman who faces adversity with grace and dignity is a woman worth defending." The small crowd that had gathered around Mrs. Abernathy shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to being challenged so directly. Martha felt tears prick her eyes at Elena's unexpected support, but before she could respond, Will appeared at her side. "Mrs. Vasquez," he said warmly, "thank you for your kind words. Martha, are you ready to go?" As they walked away from the church, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred. Eleanor's public support had shifted the dynamic somehow, reminding everyone present that the Torres family had their own community of loyal friends and employees who would stand with them. "She didn't have to do that," Martha said quietly as they made their way down Main Street. "Elena has known me since I was 12 years old," Will replied. "She helped my mother when I was sick with pneumonia one winter, and she's been like a second mother to me ever since. If she believes in us, that means something." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, their breath visible in the frigid air. As they passed the general store, Martha noticed that someone had left a small package on the front steps. She bent to retrieve it, recognizing the careful handwriting on the brown paper wrapper. "It's addressed to both of us," she said, surprised. Will took the package and carefully opened it, revealing a small wooden box carved with intricate designs. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was a delicate silver locket in the shape of a heart. "There's a note," Martha said, unfolding the small piece of paper that had been tucked beneath the locket. The message was brief but heartfelt. "For Martha and Will, may your love be as enduring as the mountains and as pure as the snow, from a friend who believes in true love." "Who could have sent this?" Martha asked, her voice filled with wonder. Will examined the locket more closely, his expression thoughtful. "I have my suspicions," he said finally, "but I think our anonymous friend would prefer to remain anonymous." Martha lifted the locket from its box, marveling at its delicate beauty. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. May I?" Will asked, taking the locket from her hands. With gentle fingers, he fastened the chain around her neck, the silver heart settling just above her own heart. "Perfect," he said softly, his hands lingering on her shoulders. As they stood there in the falling snow, Martha felt as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them. The doubts and fears that had plagued her for months seemed to melt away like snow in spring sunshine. This man loved her truly, deeply, completely, and she loved him the same way. "Martha," Will said, his voice suddenly serious, "there's something I need to tell you, something I've been planning." Martha's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Will took her hands in his brown eyes steady and sure. "I've been corresponding with my sister in California. I told her about you, about us, and she's invited us to visit her ranch next spring. She wants to meet the woman who's captured her brother's heart." Martha stared at him, stunned. "She wants to meet me." "She does. And more than that, she's excited about it. She wrote that she's been praying for years that I'd find someone special, someone who could see past my gruff exterior and appreciate the man underneath." Will smiled, his expression tender. "Apparently she has quite a few opinions about the kind of woman I should marry." "And what kind is that?" Martha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone kind," Will said, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her hands. "Someone strong, someone who's faced adversity and emerged with her compassion intact. Someone who makes me want to be a better man." Martha felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Will, I know this has been difficult," Will continued, his voice growing more earnest. I know people have said cruel things, tried to make you doubt yourself, doubt us. But I need you to know something, Martha. I need you to understand that what we have is real, and it's worth fighting for. Before Martha could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the spell of the moment. Both of them turned to see a group of riders approaching through the snow, and Martha's blood ran cold as she recognized Thomas Brennan in the lead. But as the riders drew closer, Martha realized something had changed. Brennan looked different, chastened, almost humble. Behind him rode Sheriff Crawford and two other men Martha didn't recognize, all of them wearing grim expressions. Torres, Brennan said as he dismounted, his voice lacking its usual arrogance. Miss Hawkins, I came to apologize. Martha exchanged a glance with Will, both of them too surprised to speak. I heard what happened at the church today, Brennan continued, his eyes fixed on the ground. What Mrs. Vasquez said, it got me thinking about some things I'd rather not think about. Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, his expression stern. Tell them the rest of it, Brennan. Brennan's jaw tightened, but he met Martha's eyes with what looked like genuine remorse. I've been drinking too much lately, saying things I shouldn't say, doing things I shouldn't do. My wife, she left me last month, took the children and went back to her mother's house. Said she couldn't stand the man I'd become. Martha felt a stab of unexpected sympathy for the man who had terrorized her just weeks before. She was right, Brennan continued, his voice growing stronger. I've been angry at the world, angry at myself, and I took it out on people who didn't deserve it, especially you, Miss Hawkins. You never did anything to me except have the courage to show your face in public, and I punished you for it because, he paused, struggling with the words, because it made me feel better about my own failures. Thomas, Will said quietly, we appreciate your apology, but what's done is done. No, Brennan said, shaking his head. It's not done. Not until I make it right. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote this letter to the editor of the Cedar Falls Herald. It's an apology to you both and to the town. I'm telling everyone that I was wrong, that what I did was shameful, and that anyone who has a problem with your relationship will have to answer to me. Martha stared at the letter, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. You don't have to. Yes, I do, Brennan interrupted. I do have to, because a man who can't admit his mistakes isn't much of a man at all. He handed the letter to Will, then remounted his horse. I hope you'll both accept my apology, and I hope you'll have a long and happy life together. You deserve it. As the riders disappeared into the swirling snow, Martha and Will stood in stunned silence. Finally, Will unfolded the letter and read it aloud, his voice filled with wonder. To the citizens of Cedar Falls, he read, I write this letter to publicly apologize for my recent behavior toward Mr. Will Torres and Miss Martha Hawkins. My actions were inexcusable, born of my own personal failings rather than any fault of theirs. I have come to realize that their courtship represents something our community should celebrate rather than condemn, the triumph of true love over superficial concerns. Will's voice trailed off as he finished reading, and Martha felt as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The man who had been their greatest enemy had become their most unexpected advocate. What does this mean? Martha asked, her voice filled with hope. Will folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. Then he turned to Martha, his expression radiant with joy and determination. It means, he said, dropping to one knee in the snow-covered street, that it's time I asked you the question I've been carrying in my heart for months. Martha's hands flew to her mouth as Will pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Martha Elizabeth Hawkins, he said, his voice strong and clear, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my best friend for the rest of our lives? Through her tears, Martha could see the beautiful ring nestled in the box, a simple gold band with a small diamond that sparkled like captured starlight. But more than that, she could see the love in Will's eyes, the absolute certainty that this was right, that they were meant to be together. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, I'll marry you. Will slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around in the falling snow. As he set her down, Martha realized that people had begun to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion in the street. She expected to see disapproval, condemnation, the same cruel stares she'd endured for years. Instead, she saw something that took her breath away. Smiles, nods of approval. Mrs. Peterson wiping tears from her eyes. Dr. and Mrs. Harrison applauding from their front porch. Even some of the women who had been her harshest critics seemed to be caught up in the romance of the moment. "Congratulations," called out Samuel Hawkins from the store's front porch, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome to the family, Will." As the impromptu celebration continued around them, Will pulled Martha close and whispered in her ear, "They called you too ugly to marry, but I knew better. I knew you were the most beautiful woman in the world." Martha looked up at the man who had seen her true worth when no one else could, the man who had waited patiently for her to see it herself. "And you waited," she said softly. "You waited until everyone else left to take my hand." "I would have waited forever," Will replied, his voice filled with the promise of a lifetime, "because some things are worth waiting for." As they kissed in the falling snow, surrounded by the cheers of their community, Martha knew that their love story was just beginning. They would face challenges in the years to come, moments of doubt and difficulty, but they would face them together. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The quiet rancher had kept his promise, and the woman they'd called too ugly to marry had found her happily ever after.